Hello and welcome to Telesur. I'm Doris Polo in Quito, and this is From the South. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has cancelled his trip to the Caribbean amid protests held by Indigenous peoples and allies against a planned pipeline project. Trudeau was expected to fly to Barbados on Monday to speak at the two-day CARICOM Heads of Government meeting, where he intended to advocate for a seat on the UN Security Council. However, concerns were raised that he would attempt to divide the region amid similar efforts by the U.S. government. Trudeau will be represented, however, by Foreign Affairs Minister François-Philippe Champagne. Now, Canada's Prime Minister is facing growing pressure as Indigenous peoples protest the construction of the coastal GasLink pipeline that would run through Wet'suwet'en territory. Land defenders and other demonstrators shut down one of Canada's busiest rail corridors over the weekend. On Saturday, Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller met with the Tyendinaga Mohawk First Nation and described the situation as highly volatile. More than 24 people were arrested in early February following similar protests. So to speak more about this, we're joined by Montreal-based journalist Ethan Cox and the editor of Ricochet Media, which has been covering these events. Hi, Ethan. How are you?
Very well. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Can you tell our viewers about the ongoing actions against the construction of a GasLink pipeline that will run through Wet'suwet'en territory?
Sure. So the first thing to understand is this is a dispute that has been going on for a long time, and it's a dispute that is also rooted in much bigger issues than just a pipeline, issues of unceded land that belongs to First Nations in Canada, and the obligation and responsibility of the government to get their consent before putting something like a pipeline through their territory. So the main site there that the RCMP raided last Monday is the Unistoten Healing Center. It's been there for over 10 years. And is an important site for the Wet'suwet'en, and they are firmly opposed to a pipeline that would go through and would potentially pollute the spawning waters of the salmon that they rely on for food and otherwise despoil their territory.
And we know a court order was granted to allow construction workers to access Indigenous territory. And despite this, the protesters, they resisted, they set up camps, but 28 people were arrested and the camps were destroyed. Are there fears of further persecution?
Well, I mean, now the situation is that the RCMP has gone in, has taken down all of the roadblocks, and is protecting the workers with the pipeline companies so that they can go in and work on building it. This is a situation that has spiraled quite rapidly in Canada, and I think we've seen reported in the Narwhal that the government's big fear in these type of situations is that the First Nations will generate public sympathy, and I think that's certainly what we've seen happening over the last week with literally hundreds of solidarity demonstrations, actions, blockades of rail lines. This type of thing in response to a raid on all of these sites, on First Nations people. You know, basically what happened is tactical units with the federal police force went in, arrested and removed First Nations people from their own territory. And that has generated a groundswell of opposition in Canada. And you also mentioned the injunction. What we hear a lot from politicians here in Canada is that the rule of law has to be respected. And when they say that, they're talking about an injunction issued by a lower court. But our Supreme Court actually found in a 1997 decision that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are the rightful title holders in that area. And of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which British Columbia adopted into law last year, demands free, prior, and informed consent before putting a resource project like this through, which obviously hasn't happened. So when we talk about the rule of law, it is perhaps more on the side of the Wet'suwet'en than it is on the government. But that's not something we see reflected in media coverage. Which
misconception about the land, because when it was first brought forward in 2007, Canada was one of about 4 countries that didn't really agree to it, but because it became international law, then it would have applied to the country.
Yes, so it hasn't been adopted into law formally by Canada, but it has been by the province of British Columbia, which is where this is happening. Um, so it is the law there. And as I said, we also have a series of Supreme Court decisions that that strongly support the land rights of First Nations like the Wet'suwet'en on unceded territory, which is what we're talking about here. So again, it's a much thornier issue than I think a lot of people give it credit for. What we're talking about here is a legacy of 150 years of colonialism and how we address that and how we start to redress some of the wrongs that have been done historically. And I think that the most affecting thing for me was one of the videos that our journalist shot, Jerome Turner, who's doing great work out at the raid of Gedimpton checkpoint by the RCMP. One of these land defenders shouted out to the RCMP, "Tell me how this is different from 150 years ago. Tell me
Yeah.
how this is different." And I think that's a very hard question to answer when you have the federal police force on unceded First Nations territory, arresting and removing people from their own land so that a pipeline can be built.
And what can you tell us about the coverage these demonstrations have received? Has the press been allowed to properly cover this issue?
No, and that's a related issue. We've had something of a crisis of press freedom happening in Canada over the course of these raids. On Thursday, when they raided the first site, journalist Jesse Winter with Vice News and another journalist were detained, removed from the area. There was a huge outcry over that, and as a result, the RCMP said, "No, no, we're gonna allow journalists to stay. We're going to allow them to report." Contrary to that, when they arrived at the Gedimpton checkpoint, they detained our journalist, held him for 8 hours, put him in a ditch where he was unable to report properly on what was going on, unable to see everything that was going on, and then didn't allow him to continue on to the Unistoten camp or to move anywhere except to leave. And then we saw a similar sort of thing in the raid on Unistoten on Monday, where several journalists who were embedded there were held in one location by the RCMP. There have been other threats of arrest made against journalists. So we've had a situation where across the board media outlets trying to be there for these raids, trying to cover these nonviolent expressions, have been restricted from doing their job by the RCMP. And that assault on press freedom has been denounced by virtually every major international press freedom group, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and Amnesty International.
With the Prime Minister cancelling his trip to Canada, does or do Indigenous people have any faith that he would address their concerns going forward?
I think it's very hard for them to have faith in what's coming out of the government because the discussion from the government is entirely focused on the disruption to the economy and ending the disruption to the economy. And I think everything we've heard from the Prime Minister, from the Premier of British Columbia, from every level of government is that they want this pipeline to go through and they want the blockades and solidarity actions to stop. And I think those are somewhat contradictory aims. The all of these people who are in the streets or blocking rail lines and what have you, what they're demanding is that the RCMP withdraw from Wet'suwet'en territory. And so, there's not much indication that the government has any interest in looking at these issues of Indigenous rights and title, in maybe putting a hold on the pipeline project while discussions happen. Right now, what we're seeing from the government is just a desire to push this pipeline through and to end disruptions to rail service and whatnot else without actually doing anything about the underlying issues.
Well, Ethan, we are out of time, but we really do appreciate you joining us to provide your version of what is taking place, the real version of what is taking place in Canada at this time between the government and Indigenous peoples.
Yes, of course. My pleasure. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ethan Cox, a journalist based in Montreal and also the editor of Ricochet Media coming out of Canada. We'll take a short break now. Don't go anywhere.
Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomen. Monday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Protests and candlelight vigils were held in several cities, including Santo Domingo Este and Villa Progreso, following the announcement of the suspension of municipal elections in the Dominican Republic on Sunday. Citizens protested and burned tires in rejection of the decision. Political parties are demanding that all members of the electoral body resign. According to the president of the electoral body, Julio Cesar Castaños, more than half of the electronic devices used in the nationwide election did not work properly, causing virtual ballot papers not to load. He said the elections will be rescheduled to a later date. In Venezuela, the Bolivarian National Armed Forces successfully completed the Bolivarian Shield 2020 drills held over the weekend. More than 2,300,000 troops participated in the military exercises, which were held throughout the country. The exercises, which were called by President Nicolas Maduro, were intended to strengthen the civic-military union in the context of the recent approval of a new law which incorporates the Bolivarian civilian militia as a component of the military. Missile, air defense and terrestrial systems were tested in areas which included the Colombian border region, but also in cities. President Maduro has argued that the strengthening of the territorial defense is critical, given the ongoing attempts by the United States to intervene in the country's internal affairs.
This tests out the levels that we have reached for preparation in defense of the country. Incredible. I'm amazed by the exercise of command and control, which is the capacity to communicate, to lead, to conduct, and through distinct coding, signals, messages, means of communication. The level that the Bolivarian militia has reached is impressive, to complement the rest of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. For that reason, we are glad that this component of the militia has been incorporated into the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. With this will be impenetrable, as our commander Chavez would say. The state is impenetrable, the people impenetrable, our geographic space is impenetrable, the homeland impenetrable.
As we continue with news in Latin America, residents of the city of Sacaba, Chocabamba in Bolivia marked 3 months since the massacre of November 15th against community members who protested against the coup which took out President Evo Morales on November 10th. Families and residents gathered to mark the day when 9 men were killed by the military in one single operation, as those residents staged a protest on the main road connecting the city of Cochabamba to the Chapare province. Area leaders of the Movement Towards Socialism party were in attendance as the victims were remembered as martyrs, killed in defense of Bolivian democracy under coup leaders Janine Áñez and her Interior Minister Arturo Murillo. The community believes that justice will only come about if the Movement Towards Socialism governs again. Moving to the Middle East, Syrian government forces have made significant advances in their military offensive against the last major rebel bastion, taking over at least 23 villages west of Aleppo. According to state television, the Russian-backed forces have liberated all the villages and small towns west of Aleppo city. The latest advances come after government forces drove rebel fighters from the key M5 highway linking Aleppo to the capital Damascus and reopened the fastest route between Syria's 2 biggest cities for the first time in years. Well, residents of Aleppo have gathered in the streets to celebrate recent advances by the Syrian Arab army in regaining control of the city. Social media footage showed jubilant residents waving national flags and chanting slogans supporting the army and President Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, Syria's transport minister has announced the reopening of the Aleppo International Airport from the liberation of the city from Western-backed rebels. He has since instructed the relevant authorities to take up all measures required to get the airport operational. The first flight is expected to land from Wednesday morning from Damascus. It will be the first time a civilian aircraft lands at the airport since the war forced its closure in 2012. Now, Syria's President Bashar al-Assad has received an Iranian delegation headed by Speaker of the Parliament Ali Larijani. During the meeting, President Assad hailed the strong bilateral ties between the two countries, which have helped them to defeat Western-sponsored armed groups that have been destabilizing the region. For his part, Larijani affirmed Tehran's continued support to Damascus's efforts to stop the spread of chaos and destabilization pursued by some Western countries, led by the United States. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says the Donald Trump administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign has failed to break the Iranian revolution. Despite what the ill-wishers wanted, he said, our problems this year are less than that of last year, and the fact that conditions are tougher than last year, all social security and economic injustices show that the United States maximum pressure has failed and is now behind us. There is no doubt that the Americans have come to the conclusion today that the path and strategy they had chosen was based on a miscalculation and will not affect the great Iranian nation. This Monday marks 9 years since former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown and killed by rebels supported by then U.S. President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, along with their NATO allies. 9 years down the line, the people of Libya are yet to see the freedom and democracy that NATO promised them. The once prosperous nation has plunged into chaos and bloodshed, with different warlords and militias vying for the control of the country. The nation that was once at the center of Pan-African unity has become an open-air slave market, with black Africans sold for as little as $400. Relatives of the victims of Sudan's Darfur war have welcomed the decision by the transitional government to hand over former President Omar al-Bashir to the International Criminal Court to face genocide and war crimes. The family said the handing over of al-Bashir to the Hague-based court is a victory for the victims of the brutal war. Al-Bashir is facing 3 counts of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of war crimes perpetrated by government forces and allied militias during the Darfur War between 2003 and 2008.
The handing over of Bashir is a victory for the victims, a victory for all the Sudanese people, and a warning for any other person to not repeat the same actions.
We have more stories coming up, including an update on the novel coronavirus, so stay with us.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dotting the I. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Members of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, are meeting in Burkina Faso to find a solution to Nigeria's refusal to rescind its decision to close its borders. In August last year, Nigeria imposed a ban on the movement of goods from neighboring countries, allegedly to curb smuggling. The move was strongly condemned by ECOWAS, who said it goes against the principles of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Abuja has, however, insisted that it will not reopen the borders until its concerns are addressed. South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, has condemned claims by former President Frederick de Klerk that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. The ANC said de Klerk's conduct is an attempt to whitewash the brutal apartheid system. Last week, de Klerk claimed that the classification of apartheid as a crime against humanity by the United Nations in 1973 was part of an agenda by the Soviet Union and the ANC to stigmatize white South Africans. China's National Health Commission says it has found an effective combination of drugs for the treatment of the COVID-19. The Commission's deputy director told journalists on Monday that doctors discovered that chloroquine phosphate, an anti-malarial drug, can be effectively used to cure mild cases of the virus. She added that as of Sunday, more than 10,000 patients have been successfully treated and discharged from health facilities. China has been racing against time to contain the outbreak that has so far killed 1,765 people and infected more than 70,000 worldwide.
Our answer is clear. Although it is a new infection disease, it is controllable and curable. According to the latest data as of Sunday, more than 10,000 were cured and discharged from hospitals. Early diagnosis and early treatment are very effective ways to improve the cure rate. We also analyze our patients' treatment. More than 90% of the patients received antiviral treatment and symptomatic treatment. We enhanced their immunity and provided breathing and circulation support. Such therapies have accelerated patients' recovery. The situation in Wuhan improved a lot. By early diagnosis and treatment and continuous observation of patients with mild symptoms, we can see the proportion of critical cases has dropped from 38% to 18%.
The Israeli Air Force has carried out airstrikes on the besieged Gaza Strip. Local media reports say fighter jets and helicopters on Sunday evening bombed several sites south of the city of Deir al-Balah, causing damage to homes and public buildings. The Israeli military claimed that the raids were in response to the firing of 2 projectiles from the besieged enclave. No injuries have been reported so far. Meanwhile, Israeli security forces on Saturday attacked a group of Palestinians who attempted to remove a barrier that blocked access to their village in the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, Israeli soldiers put up barriers across several roads in towns and villages to the north and west of the city of Ramallah. Israel severely restricts Palestinians' freedom of movement through the use of approximately 100 fixed checkpoints, mobile checkpoints, settler-only roads, and other physical obstructions. And we leave you with a presentation by La Gran Muñeca during Uruguay's Carnival with a song that speaks of the repression under Presidents Macri in Argentina and Piñera in Chile, racism under President Bolsonaro in Brazil, the coup in Bolivia, and how poverty is growing in most countries under right-wing governments. So, until next time, enjoy. Llegamos al carnaval para defender la tierra. Llegamos al carnaval, hoy América despierta. Pueblos originarios que se juntaron para luchar contra los dictadores evangelistas de Donald Trump. Este es nuestro lugar y tenemos que cuidarlo. Nadie nos podrá callar. Suena fuerte nuestro canto. Somos la patria grande y ahora nadie nos va a parar. Entre todas y todos el continente resistirá. Macri ya no está más, que la gente no se olvide, que le gusta reprimir, igual que Piñera.
en Chile. Afuera Bolsonaro con su racismo que nos asusta.
Fuera la vieja cheta que está en Bolivia y se cree rubia.
Ecuador está muy mal, paga el pobre, gana el rico. Colombia se despertó, en Perú mandan milicos. Vemos que la derecha vino por todo una vez más. Y hasta no conseguirlo queda muy claro, no va a parar.
Algo que no entendemos que le ha pasado al Uruguay.
Porque se han olvidado de las miserias y hoy son gobierno